Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcia Johnson, and I co-direct the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Thank you so much for joining this discussion on the impact of the recently introduced American Confidence in Elections Act, which will have a very deleterious impact on traditionally disfranchised and vulnerable voters. It is very telling that the act was introduced by House Republican leaders this past July during a field hearing in Georgia, considering that Georgia has been at the forefront of suppressive legislation that the Lawyers Committee is currently challenging in court. As you will hear, the ACE Act borrows some of its provisions from suppressive legislation such as that passed in Georgia. The ACE Act represents one vision of how and who should and can have access to the ballot. It's one that makes it harder to vote and relies on a false narrative of pervasive voter fraud. Today, you will hear from the incredibly knowledgeable panel of voting rights advocates about the impact of the provisions of the ACE Act and what you can do to fight for a more inclusive, multiracial democracy. We welcome your questions. Please put any you have in the chat. I will now turn the discussion over to our moderator, Alex Ault, who will introduce the panelists. Alex?
Thank you, Marcia. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion. I'm Alex Ault. I'm a policy counsel at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this discussion with distinguished colleagues and leaders in the fight for voting rights. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because before I joined the Lawyers Committee as a policy counsel, I worked at an organization that was focused on state and local level voting changes, fighting needless discriminatory barriers to the ballot, and fighting for positive policy changes concerning voter registration, ballot access, and voter certification, which I know we will cover in depth today. I am thrilled to be joined by LaTosha Brown today. LaTosha is an award-winning visionary thought leader, institution builder, cultural activist and artist, and connector. She's a nationally recognized go-to expert in Black voting rights and voter suppression, Black women's empowerment, and philanthropy. LaTosha is the co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund and Black Voters Matter Capacity Building Institute. These initiatives are designed to boost Black voter registration and turnout, as well as increase power in marginalized, predominantly Black communities. I'm also joined today by two colleagues, Julie Hoke, who joined the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law as a senior special counsel in the Voting Rights Project in May 2014 and began her current role as managing counsel for election protection in October 2018. Since joining the Lawyers Committee, Julie's focus has been on voting rights litigation and election protection work that has sought to ensure equal access to the ballot for all voters, and in particular for voters of color. I'm also joined today by Caleb Jackson, who joined the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law as a policy counsel in April of 2022. He engages in federal policy advocacy with the legislative and executive branches on voting rights, criminal justice, educational opportunity, and Black farmers issues, along with other racial justice issues. Prior to joining the Lawyers Committee, he worked on both voting rights litigation and policy at the Campaign Legal Center. So welcome to you all, and I want to take this opportunity to turn it over to Caleb, who can walk us through the ACE Act, what's in it, and some of the particularly problematic provisions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex, and a pleasure to be here with you all today. So during my presentation, I'm going to just walk us through some of the worst provisions in the ACE Act. This is a very big bill, so there are a ton of sections, a ton of provisions, primarily focusing on voting, focusing on campaign finance, and there are also military voting provisions in there as well. This presentation will primarily, or exclusively rather, focus on the voting provisions, and we're not able to cover everything, but we wanted to just give you all a sample size of some of the worst things in the bill. So to start us off, here's a quick overview, just 5 things in the bill that we view is extremely problematic, and I'll go into detail as we get into the later slides. So the first, voter ID requirements for mail ballots. Voter ID, is an issue that a lot of people don't understand to be problematic, but truly is problematic. We know from our work here at the Lawyers Committee that usually Black voters and voters of color have voter ID at a disproportionately lower rate than white voters. So a lot of times these requirements are added specifically to target Black voters, voters of color. The next thing is documentary proof of citizenship, which is requiring voters to provide, either a birth certificate, social security card, or a naturalization card when they register to vote. If that doesn't seem problematic to you, just think of when you registered to vote, it was probably at a table at your college campus or at your grocery store. If they would have said, wait, show us your birth certificate, you probably would have gone along your way because no one keeps that kind of stuff on them. So this is an extremely problematic provision as well. Next, repeal of President Biden's voting executive order. On Bloody Sunday in 2021, President Biden issued an executive order that was meant to make it easier for federal agencies to help eligible citizens register to vote. This bill would completely repeal that, revoke that, get rid of that, and kind of prohibit federal agencies from taking steps to make it easier for citizens to register to vote. Next, we have a takeover of Washington, D.C. local election law. We've seen this in the criminal justice context. This term, the House seems, pretty focused on overriding the will of D.C. residents and D.C. citizens. And this bill kind of takes, the worst of the worst provisions from the voter suppression bills we've seen across the country, whether it's Texas, whether it's Arizona, whether it's Georgia, and would apply those things to DC voters specifically. So I'll talk about some of those issues as well. And then finally, kind of a very, I guess, litigious provision, we would say, the Speaker of the House would have a role in congressional redistricting. So for some reason, the ACE Act thinks it's a good idea for the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives to be able to file original lawsuits and intervene in existing lawsuits concerning congressional redistricting. This is problematic for a variety of reasons as well, and this would be unprecedented, and I'll get into that. So just to start off with the voter ID requirements, the ACE Act would require all voters nationwide to submit some form of ID if they are unable to register to vote in person. So you think about this, if you're applying for a mail ballot, it's because you probably don't want to vote in person. So requiring someone to request that mail ballot in person defeats the entire purpose of mail voting. So the only alternative under this bill would be to provide a form of ID. I've included the forms of ID below. These are things that are also problematic. We know them to be problematic for a variety of reasons. For one, most of the requirements require someone to submit a copy of some form of documentation when they return their ballot. We know that Black voters, voters of color, rural voters, low-income voters do not have access to printers. So this would require someone to either go pay to access a printer or pay someone to print something for them, or, find some other way to get a printer to just mail their ballot back. The other thing here that folks might try to frame as unproblematic and truly is that another alternative is someone can list either their driver's license number or their state ID number or the last four of their social. You may think, oh, so someone doesn't have to print something off. They could just list their ID number. But we know that this is problematic as well. Texas implemented this requirement in SB 1, and it led to sky-high rejection rates after it was immediately implemented. In Texas, their rejection rate jumped to 12% statewide after it was only 1% statewide in the election before they implemented this requirement. So we know this to be extremely problematic as well. And we also know it to be something that disproportionately impacts voters of color. As you'll see on this slide, after Texas implemented a similar requirement, 19% of Asian voters, 16.6% of Black voters, and 16.1% of Latino voters had their ballots rejected or their applications to vote by mail rejected, compared to just 12% of white voters. And getting into documentary proof of citizenship, I covered this earlier, just requiring someone to show either a certificate of naturalization, a social security card, birth certificate to register to vote. Obviously, again, think about a voter registration drive at your local church, your local grocery store, your local school. Most people are able to do it, fill out a form very quickly, and go on about their way. This would be a burden. This will require someone to actually either have those documents on them, which no one has, or mail those documents in. So it's something else that could impact millions of voters seeking to just register to vote. Next, we have President Biden's voting executive order, which I spoke about. Just to provide you some examples, one thing that the Department of Education has sought to do after the implementation of this executive order is incorporate voter registration into everyday interactions like FAFSA. So if someone is applying for their FAFSA, they would have an opportunity to register to vote. The Department of Interior has tribal colleges, and they've allowed those colleges to be able to, encourage people to register to vote. So this executive order really does a great job at reaching communities that do not see the significance or importance of registering to vote and allowing them to register to vote. But the ACE Act would repeal that executive order, revoke it, and make it harder for folks, and specifically federal agencies, to encourage voter registration. And then next, we have the takeover of Washington, D.C.'s local election law, which includes some very egregious things. So one thing, for example, in D.C., if you're registered to vote, you can register to vote the day of the election. Same day registration has been shown to, increase the rate at which people vote by significant margins, not just in DC, but all across the country. This would not only ban that, but it will require voters to register 30 days before an election if they want to vote in that election. And that's the outermost limit in federal law. You cannot require someone to register for a period of time longer than that. So that's just one egregious example. I have other egregious examples listed here. One of them, which I know Julie will probably talk about, is the Dropbox restrictions. They, basically copied the restriction in Georgia's SB 202, which would require a Dropbox to be inside a building, which would not only prevent or, completely negate the point of a Dropbox, but it would also limit people to being able to drop their ballots off during the building's business hours. Right now in DC, you can drop your ballot off at a Dropbox 24 hours a day, and they are accessible outside of buildings in a variety of locations. But this, similar to the Georgia bill, would severely restrict that. And then finally, giving the Speaker of the House a role in redistricting. So this is, really a super problematic section of this bill, because the Speaker of the House would be able to intervene in a congressional redistricting suit. So imagine right now everyone is focused on Alabama. Imagine if Kevin McCarthy was able to intervene in the Alabama congressional redistricting suit and say, no, actually, we have a say in the statistical methods used in the suit. We think it's problematic. We think we have a right to be a party in this suit. That would be extremely problematic. And this is not just something that would be problematic, we think, because of the party that currently runs the House. We don't think any Speaker of the House, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, should be able to intervene in congressional redistricting suits. These suits are extremely local. If a Speaker of the House lives in New York or in California, they have no role to play in a congressional redistricting suit in Alabama or elsewhere. So this is just the final provision that we've decided to focus on today. But there are several more provisions in the ACE Act that are problematic. And I'm excited to continue talking about these as we continue going through our panel.
Well, Caleb, thank you so much for covering all that. I know there's so much to discuss in this bill, but that was a lot of material in a short amount of time. And I want to thank you for breaking it down for us. I want to turn it over to Julie a little bit, who I know is not shocked by some of what she just heard from Caleb, because so many of these provisions mirror state law provisions that Julie and our organization and others have been suing over and fighting on the ground for years. So to talk a little bit about that, I want to turn it over to Julie Hauck.
I'll talk a little bit about the provisions of some of Georgia law that we're currently challenging in courts in Georgia that mirror some of the aspects of the ACE Act. First off, as Caleb mentioned, The ID requirement for absentee voting is something that Georgia implemented as part of its SB 202 law that was enacted in March of 2021. That changed a longstanding pattern of absentee ballot voting in Georgia, which had little to no evidence of any significant voter fraud being involved. Nevertheless, the legislature imposed an ID requirement where voters are required to include the Georgia driver's license number or Georgia state ID number on their absentee ballot application. If they don't have one of those IDs, they have to actually physically copy alternative IDs, such as utility bills or government documents, passports, etc. One of the items that was specifically not included in the bill that allowed people to just fill in an ID number was Georgia's so-called free voter ID card, which is often given to lower income voters who don't have a car, have no need to register to get a car or a driver's license, and don't have the state ID number. And so they specifically excluded that. So even voters who have that free ID have to make a physical copy of it to supply when they apply to register for an absentee ballot. And we've seen so far in Georgia, this process has resulted in the disenfranchisement of many Georgia voters who, for whatever reason, can't make those copies, don't exactly comply with the requirements, or have other issues in being able to submit those ID documents with their forms. In addition, people who are of low income often don't have easy access to copy machines at home or computers to make those copies. So we believe that this bill, in terms of the ID requirement for absentee ballots, specifically targeted Black voters and other voters of color in communities who don't have the resources to have these copy machines and other equipment available to submit the documentation with their IDs. In addition, at the time the state enacted this law, they knew Black voters in Georgia disproportionately did not have Georgia issued driver's licenses or Georgia state ID numbers. So off the bat, they knew that there'd be a disadvantage to Black voters complying with this law based on the ID requirement. Another provision of SB 202 is the reduction in the number and availability of drop boxes in Georgia. Prior to SB 202, counties were able to construct drop boxes wherever they wanted to, as long as they were surveilled with 24-hour video surveillance. They allowed voters to submit absentee ballots around the clock, 24/7. They were collected on a regular basis. Accounting methods were provided so that voters were ensured that the election officials were picking up the ballots on a regular basis. There's virtually no evidence of voter fraud in connection with Georgia's absentee ballot drop boxes. Nevertheless, when SB 202 was passed, it was drastically changed. First off, and we believe this is evidence of the targeting of Black voters for this law, that in counties that previously had large numbers of drop boxes, primarily in the metro Atlanta area with a large proportion of Black voters and other voters of color, they could no longer have those large numbers of drop boxes because the law restricts drop boxes to one and then one additional for every 100,000 voters. So in Fulton County, for example, this reduced the drop boxes from 2020 in Fulton County from 37 to just 8 after the law was passed. In DeKalb County, which is also in the metro Atlanta area, the drop boxes were reduced from 33 in 2020 to 5. And in Gwinnett County, the drop boxes were reduced from 24 to 6. So right off the bat, that law passed in 2021 has now prevented Black voters and other voters of color, primarily in the metro Atlanta area, from having that easy access to the drop boxes. Worse, the drop boxes now have to be inside early voting locations during the times and dates of early voting. So that means that voters no longer have access to the drop boxes until the close of polls on election day. So people who at the last minute find out they can't return their absentee ballots by mail or otherwise no longer have 24/7 through election day access to those drop boxes. In addition, since they're only open during the early voting hours, that means people who work untraditional hours and can't get to a polling place during the schedule they're open during the day are no longer able to use those drop boxes. And finally, people who have physical challenges, who enjoyed the use of the outdoor drop boxes because it made them more accessible, no longer have that easy accessibility. So that's been a big change in the drop boxes in Georgia as a result of SB 202. And it appears from the ACE Act that's a similar goal of the ACE Act to limit access to drop boxes because of the people that they serve. Caleb also talked about documentary proof of citizenship. Lawyers Committee has been in a longstanding battle with the state of Georgia over proof of citizenship. The state enacted their proof of citizenship law in 2010. However, because of court rulings, they were never able to implement it. And so now the ACE Act tries to get around the requirement previously that the EAC had to adopt changes to the voter registration form so that they would include the requirement of producing documentary proof of citizenship. So now we find that Georgians are still disenfranchised because the state uses outdated driver's services records to verify citizenship when people register to vote. And that will likely continue to disenfranchise other people in other states if the ACE Act is passed.
Thank you, Julie. I really appreciate that overview. It's nice to know, what's happened in this legislation and also, what we've seen before and what we've been fighting against. I do want to take a moment to remind anybody in the audience, if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. We're going to have hopefully a fulsome discussion of all these issues right at the end here. But before we go to questions and kind of open up this discussion, we've heard the federal impact. We've heard what we've been fighting and suing over in the states. Now I really want to bring in Latasha to help drive home what this means for actual people on the ground. What sort of negative impact have Black voters and voters of color seen under these types of provisions before?
Thank you so much for having me and having this important discussion. I think we have to recognize that there is individual impact and there's also a cumulative impact for our communities. And what we have seen throughout Georgia, I'll use Georgia as an example because what we're seeing on the national level is really modeled on what happened in Georgia. Right after the election, the 2021 election in Georgia, what we saw is this uptick in creating legislation coming out the state legislature that would disenfranchise voters, and particularly targeted at Black voters in the state of Georgia. And this bill that we're referring to, this SB 202 bill that was actually passed and enacted and signed by the governor, was basically a bill meant to punish, to be punitive to voters who had come out in an election year multiple times. If people can recall, what you saw is an influx of new voters, young voters, voters of color, the largest that participated ever in the history of the state. And as a backlash, what we saw was the formation of this bill, SB 202, which severely not only is what I call is a voter suppression blueprint bill, but it's also had a direct impact on multiple levels on communities. One, there's a piece around communities, particularly those that are most vulnerable, that it actually puts a financial impact. That part of this is a cumulative, that if you're living in a rural area, if you don't have access to transportation, Or if some people cannot afford, there were people that stood in line during the election cycle up to 12 hours. And you heard me correctly, up to 12 hours. It was a shame that ultimately there are people who cannot afford to stand in line. The truth of the matter is none of us should be subjected to that. But you saw people who were standing in line, that all of these extra barriers create an issue around time. It takes away time from people who already, that time really creates a financial barrier on them. It also puts an additional barrier on them to be able to actually you have to copy and show. Everybody does not have access to office equipment or having to copy or having to bring something. Actually, even restricting the voting booth. Mail-in ballots, being able to restrict all of those things have had an accumulative effect on Black voters, voters of color, particularly disabled voters, voters who live in rural areas, and voters who literally are, and poor voters, poor and working class people who don't have access to the same vehicles that they can actually get some of these things done. And it shouldn't be required of them. You should not be punished because of your financial situation. You should not be punished because you have a disability. That literally in a country that we're saying that we hold up democracy, why is it easier for me to move $1 million on my cell phone, but then I have to go through and jump through hurdle after hurdle after hurdle just to be able to have access to voting? And so there's one element of that has actually had an impact on individuals and puts an additional financial and economic burden on individuals. But it's also had an impact when we saw SB 202, on those organizations that are trying to actually stand in the gap and be able to provide some of the support that these voters may need, that some of the support of actually helping to make sure that they're engaged in the process and that they're not unfairly disadvantaged. And this bill specifically in Georgia went after those voters, right down to the point that it actually is technically, for organizations like mine in the state of Georgia, it is illegal to be able to pass out water and comfort care like food currently as we speak here in 2023. So I think that there's one element that we have to think about. What is happening has had a cumulative impact, that it's a shaving off, and it's been an intention, right? Chaos has been the point, right? To be able to shave off a couple of votes here, a couple of votes there. We all heard where the former president actually offered and said, can you find me 13,000 votes or whatever the number was. And the bottom line is there is a concerted effort to be able to shave off votes, and particularly those who are most vulnerable and those who are on the margins, that they feel that are on the margins that may or may not participate often, or that additional barriers would create a different kind of a different kind of barrier for them. The second thing is, we have to really recognize that even in this moment, what we saw in Georgia, I also think that Georgia can be an example of how we responded to it. That we have to recognize that if democracy in America is to be strong, then we're going to have to make it be so. We're going to have to use this as a major organizing opportunity and voter education opportunity to say that democracy is for all and should be accessible to all, which means that we actually have to think about this dual strategy that has always been used in the civil rights community. We've always had a litigation strategy that we're actually fighting in the courts, and we've always been organizing in the street, and that making sure that those things align themselves, that at the end of the day, policy without people is not effective. We know that. I often use the example of Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown versus the Board of Education was 1954. Many of the schools most schools were not desegregated until the 70s because there was a public will and there was a push because people had organized. And so we have to recognize that that yes, we've got a fight in the courts, but we also have a fight in the streets, and we have a fight in the halls of the legislative halls. And so we have to see this as a multi-pronged strategy that we have to fight on the local level, on the state level, and on the federal level, which is why we need federal legislation. It is so important that we need the complete restoration and the strengthening of the Voting Rights Act, that we're seeing a concerted effort to marginalize and target communities of color. And that if there's any time that we've needed that, we need that now. We've got to apply the pressure on all three levels, on the local level for our local elected officials, on our state level for our state elected officials, but also recognizing that particularly those of us that live in the South, we are going to need, and we need and have always needed, national and federal protection. The third piece that I want to share, I think that is really important for us that as we're organizing around this issue, that we're not framing it from the perspective of, let's go back and get what we got in 1965. Because the truth of the matter is, the Voting Rights Act for 1965 was never the exhausted act to get us to democracy. Even at that period of time, it was eons ahead of its time. It was extremely progressive, but it was a compromise. And so we have to recognize that we did not get everything we needed to get to protect and create and protect to make sure that we have a multiracial, multi-generational democracy, that people, regardless of where they live, regardless of who they are, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or geographic region, that they should have free and open access to the ballot and fair access to the ballot. We have to make sure that we are organizing, not just to make sure that we're not losing the rights that we fought for, but we've got to ask for more. That we have to actually have a radical reimagination of what is needed and make sure that we're pushing for policy that is going to actually lend itself to supporting a multifaceted democracy that literally is about representative democracy, that people, no matter where they are, no matter what language they speak, no matter what religious belief they have equal and fair access to be able to participate in the process. And if decisions are being made about them and their families, they have the fundamental right to have a part of that decision-making process. And if that is to happen, we're going to have to ensure that it happens. And so in that, I'll just recap. I think it's really important for us to recognize that this has not just an individual impact, but it has an accumulative impact and can shift a federal election, a local election, a statewide election. And those who are orchestrating behind this, they know that. And so we have to really call it what it is. This is voter suppression. They can put any name they want to put on it, but the truth of the matter is this is voter suppression that is dressed up in lipstick and a tutu skirt. And we have to call it out and know that it's unacceptable. It will not get us to the multiracial, multi-generational democracy that we desire and we deserve. The second thing is we're going to have to take this opportunity. It is an opportunity for us to do voter education in a way for people to really understand what is democracy? What is it that we're fighting for? What is it where are we going? And how are we going to strengthen what we have currently? And then the third piece is really, what is our North Star? What is it that ultimately, to get to the kind of democracy that is listed in the Constitution, that all men, quote, and women are created equal, how do we get there? It is going to require us to actually be able to push for a North Star and organize people around that North Star of what is the next iteration that will get us to the American democracy that literally is inclusive, that is representative, is fair, and is just.
Latasha, thank you so much for both grounding us and kind of expanding the context of what's happening in this country. Sometimes you get a couple lawyers in the room and you talk about statutes and you talk about provisions, and it's really nice to have you here to help ground this into what's happening to people on the ground and what we all need to be thinking about in terms of this movement. So thank you for that. I do want to transition now and have a little bit more of a conversation, get more of an interplay between all of our speakers, and also make one more plug. If you're in the audience and you've got a question or if you've got a comment, keep dropping it in the chat. I'll get fed those as we go and start to work in some of your questions, as we go through this program. But for now, I kind of want to open up to all of our speakers with one question that's on my mind as I hear you all speak, which is, why is this legislation coming now? I've heard about the state effort fights and litigation. We've heard a little bit about the political picture and what we've seen in elections, but I really want to contextualize and maybe start with Latasha and then work our way through, why do you think these things are happening in 2023? And what should the audience know about the last couple years and how this has, come on the heels of it?
The irony is that this is a response to America becoming really closer to a representative democracy. This is in response to that in a very limited way. What we know is the first couple of 100 years in this country, democracy, while on paper was defined as one thing, what we saw is that there were the infrastructure that only supported white men really being able to participate, white men with wealth, land-owning white men, right? Which fundamentally was actually the antithesis of really what democracy democracy is. And so what you're seeing is you're seeing younger people participate in this process. This last election cycle, you saw more young people and people of color to participate in elections than ever in the history of this country. And so what we're seeing, what we do know is that what we've seen, particularly as an African-American voter from the South, there's always been a white backlash when we've actually seen progress. And I think that this is in the same lines, that part of what is happening, that this democracy is opening up. What we see is we actually see a legislature, we see a Congress that has more women than has ever had in the history of this country. We're seeing younger people who are running for office and actually are effectively running campaigns and winning public office. And so now I think what we're seeing is in the rise of, and I think it's the time it makes sense, that the rise of white supremacy and white nationalism, and those that are actually ascribing to that, to white supremacy and white nationalism, they also see democracy as a threat to their standing. And they are correct that at the end of the day, we are trying to build a democracy that is literally inclusive and representative. And so what I think has happened, and is that if you look at the numbers, is that it has been the participation of people who look different, many who have not participated in the process, that now we're seeing punitive measures to discourage those people because they will shape the policies, and they're shaping the state houses and will shape the Congress as we're going forward.
Yeah, I mean, everything Latasha said is completely true. And I think, it's also a response to the momentum that organizers like Latasha have built over the years. As we know, got closer to passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act than it had ever since, 2013. And so I think what we're seeing in Congress is a response to that, a kind of, trying to present an alternative motive, where one side is saying everyone should be able to vote. America is changing. Let's make sure we have a fully participatory democracy. You have another side saying, actually, maybe everyone shouldn't vote. You have another side saying, how about we pick the voters instead of having the voters pick us? So I think that that's what we're seeing right now. Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, and Caleb, can I jump in here? You mentioned another piece of legislation, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. What is sort of the vision of that, and how does this compare to just make sure that everyone in the audience is aware?
Yeah, so, I think Latasha mentioned this as well. It will basically restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As I'm sure folks know, in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down the heart and soul of the Voting Rights Act. So we've really been operating in kind of a no man's land since that time. And that's why you've seen states like Georgia, states like Alabama, states like Texas, states all over the country pass these egregious laws, because before 2013, they wouldn't have been able to do that. The Department of Justice would have had to pre-clear it. A federal court would have had to pre-clear it. And now they can get away with all of these discriminatory changes, these discriminatory congressional districts, and really purposefully discriminate against Black voters and voters of color without having themselves checked. So I think that, this legislation, they know how hard we're pushing for that. They know how hard we're fighting for that. And not just that, like Latasha said, we need additional federal legislation as well, because even when the Voting Rights Act was at full strength, it wasn't enough. But I think that the ACE Act is really trying to be a response to that and say, oh, you want to improve voting access? Well, how about we add all these things in here that will actually restrict it?
And Julie, is what Caleb said kind of track with your experience on the ground litigating, that states have kind of gotten away with a lot more, and so you see a lot more of these bad ideas percolating upward?
Yes, I think that's true, Alex, that in particular in Georgia, where the legislature, which a majority conservative white legislature, really crammed this law down in record pace. It started out as a 2-page bill, SB 202, and blossomed into, I think, 98 pages long of restrictions upon restrictions upon restrictions. And the restrictions reflected the methods of election that Black voters in Georgia were increasingly using since 2018. Prior years, Black voters were often, concerned that their ballots might not count if they delivered them via absentee ballot, delivery in a mailbox. So after the drop boxes became available, they were embraced by Black voters and other voters of color. And, I think the legislature immediately understood that the growing political power of Black voters in Georgia was something that they needed to tamp down for their own purposes. And so I think that's now reflected in how the ASAC sort of developed from SB 202 and other restrictive laws around the country, that they saw the political power rising of Black voters and voters of color, and they wanted to have a legislative response to that, which in our view is discriminatory.
You know,
Thank
Alex,
you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Latasha, jump
I
in.
just wanted to add something. You know, because I love the framing even of the conversation, like this bill is going bad to worse. But I actually want to add a addendum to that. It's going from bad to worse to better to how it should be. The truth of the matter, America has never made up her promises. Never. We have never had the multiracial democracy that we deserve, right? And so this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for us not to just push back on what's happening, but to demand and to create and put ourselves in position so that we're literally creating the kind of democracy that literally is going to lend itself to a representative democracy. We cannot allow a couple of things. I'll just say real quick. One, we can't allow this issue to get boxed in as a partisan issue. This is not a partisan issue. There are times that I've actually had to sue the Democrats in the state of Alabama for some egregious acts around voter suppression. And so we have to act as citizens, and those of us that are civil rights advocates have to recognize that we can't get caught up in the partisanship piece around that, because that's also designed as a strategy and a tool for one side to actually be able to leverage against the other side. That's its own fight. We have to recognize that regardless, right, of who is in office, who is in position, that we literally have to have legislation that is going to protect us at all costs, whether it's our safety and civil rights should not be protected just based on who is in office, right? That we have to literally have a strategy that the Constitution, that this country, that there's policy in place to make sure that whoever is governing, that the interests and the civil rights of the people of that nation really are protected. And so I just want us to look at this as an opportunity for us to push to get to the place that we've never been before, but the place that we're going to go and the place that we need to go if we're really going to have the democracy and the Constitution is going to hold itself to be true.
Thank you. That is a great point, and it kind of segues very neatly into what I want to kind of get Julie's opinion on. You know, Julie, I've been leaning you on as a litigator, but you also have a large role to play in election protection. And so if Latasha is, bad to worse to better to what we should have, election protection and kind of giving voters resources plays a large role in this. Now, I know you've talked a lot about Georgia and some of the bad provisions that are also in this bill, like clawing back mail ballot receipt deadlines or adding restrictions on drop boxes. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you've seen that play out on the ground and the type of complaints and advocacy that the election protection hotline can do for voters in situations confronting all this.
Thanks, Alex. Election protection is a coalition of national groups and also groups in the states that work together to provide voters with tools that they need to be able to cast a ballot that will count and to help problem solve on election day and during early voting periods. We have an 866 Our Vote hotline, but voters can call for help when they're at the polling place. If they're on a cell phone or elsewhere, they can ask for advice and help that way. And through election protection, we sort of view it as also filling a gap where now civic education is on the downswing when it should be on the upswing, and many people are not getting the tools through education what they need to cast ballots that are going to count. So through election protection, we can problem solve when someone's at the polling place and told they're out of precinct voting and their vote's not going to count, what they have to do to make it count. Part of the provisions of SB 202, of course, was to prohibit any out-of-precinct voting before 5 p.m., which was contrary to longstanding Georgia law. So a lot of people were confused in the 2021 and 2022 elections about that provision when they showed up and thought they could cast the ballot wherever they were in their county. So election protection helps to fill that gap. But, we prefer the law to be equitable to begin with, so we're not filling that gap, but we're there to help.
Great. That makes sense to me. And so, kind of going back to that need for a policy fight and a better vision for what we want in the future, kind of like Latasha's point, I want to go to Caleb. This bill seems to acknowledge a role for the federal government in helping fund and regulate elections, but then it also tries to undermine the federal government from encouraging voter registration or be involved in voter registration when regular voters are interacting with federal agencies. What do you make of that? And how do we, push back on that? And where is the role of, the federal government in helping set that vision and being able to easily register to vote?
That's a great question, Alex. I mean, you're absolutely right. On one hand, it says, if you look at the bill closely, all throughout the bill, it says the federal government shouldn't have a role in voting rights, right? Or Congress shouldn't play a role in voting rights. But then on the other hand, it says the Speaker of the House can intervene in redistricting suits. And then it also says, oh, if you allow ballot harvesting, we're going to pull your election funding. So, it's really a contradictory bill. To your specific question, we think that the federal government should be able to play a role in encouraging voters to vote. Now, we agree the federal government has no role in telling folks who to vote for. And we agree that the federal government has no partisan role to play in elections and voter access. But President Biden's executive order was not some partisan executive order. All it did was allow federal agencies that interact with citizens who aren't registered to vote to be able to register to vote, make it easier for them to register to vote. So going back to some of the things we were discussing earlier, if you lived in a rural area and you don't have access to a Department of Motor Vehicles, or you don't have access to some other kind of state-based agency that facilitates voter registration, you may be closer to a USDA office, or you may be closer, if you're near a reservation, you may be closer to a Department of Interior office. So this executive order was simply meant to make it easier for those other federal agencies to facilitate voter registration, not telling anyone who to vote for or how to vote. And this bill, what it does is restrict that, prohibit that, prevent that. And once again, it's obvious that one of the themes here is that the sponsors of this bill don't want all Americans who are eligible to vote to be able to vote, because they're trying to find any and every way to restrict that from happening.
So I see some questions from the audience starting to populate, and I really want to encourage people to keep sending their questions in. We are going to move to that in just a second. But before I do, I've got two more questions. And one, I really want to touch on this as a resident of DC, just for the whole panel. When I looked at this bill and kind of Control F, I saw that the bill mentions DC 163 times and has 37 pages specifically about restricting DC's options that they offer voters. And I just wanted to ask why the obsession with DC specifically, and what does this say about who the drafters are trying to target?
I think they've been the irony in all of this is that they have shamelessly gone after communities of color and people of color. DC, what we know, the nickname for DC has been Chocolate City for years and years. And so here's a city, here is a country that there's this foundational belief of no taxation without representation. That was the whole foundation and argument for the American Revolution. So the irony that the capital city is still going off a deal that President Washington cut hundreds of years ago. But here it is that in a city where you have hundreds of thousands of people, I think it's 700,000 people who are taxed and don't have representation, and so fundamentally, I think part of the reason why DC has been excluded is because it is a community of color. It is an international city that has grown. It is a younger city. It is a diverse city. And I think part of what we're seeing is that we're seeing that there is a political party in this country has decided that they don't want to represent the people of this country, that they want to represent a very small, a narrow set of issues or an agenda for a very, very small group of people. And so ultimately, I think DC is actually being victimized by a number of things. I think one, it is being victimized by the fact that it is a diverse city, that it is community, people of color, that it is a working class community, and that it could shift the balance of power in this country. We know that, but we also have to make sure that we recognize that the fighting in DC, that democracy and fight in DC is not just about the people of DC, that if they're able to continue to get away with that, then we will literally never have the fullness of democracy that we're talking about. That we have to also see that the fight in DC for statehood in DC and having the people have representation is also a national fight. It is a principle fight based on just a fundamental belief of democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just echoing Latasha, we've seen this not just in DC, we've seen it, if we're comparing this to state actions, right? We've seen it in Texas with the takeover of the Harris County School District, which governs Houston. We've seen it in Mississippi with the takeover of Jackson. So it is just this national trend, which has now made its way to Congress, of trying to tell Black people and people of color what laws they should have for themselves, despite the fact that the people they represent don't want them to have those laws. And Alex, I'll just point out one other thing. You talked about how the bill mentions so much that the federal government should not have a role in voting laws in this country. Like you said, they spent 37 pages trying to repeal what the DC City Council has decided should be the voting rules for DC, and then telling them what voting laws they should have in place. So again, it's just a huge paradox. It's because DC is a city with so many people of color, because DC folks are taxed without representation. It's just this big power grab to try to, basically govern people who don't have an option to undo any of the changes that are being proposed for their jurisdiction.
Thank you. Thank you both. So I want to take this opportunity to start to turn it over to audience questions. I have one more question, but it also seems like the audience is on the same page, because we've got a number of questions having to do with the specifics of how people can push back against this legislation and how they're recommended to fight back, including folks in the comments asking, what committees is this working through? Is the particular bill number that we should be focused on? What's the best messaging to try to overcome these concerns? So I want to incorporate kind of all those specific asks into my final question for you all, which is, how do you recommend that people fight back against this?
Yeah, so there are a variety of ways that I think people can fight back against this. By one, I guess the easiest is telling your, respective legislators that this is not a bill that you want, this is not a bill that you support, and making sure that the House of Representatives understands that this is not a bill that best serves the American people. The bill has been moving through, I believe it's the House Administration Committee, and the bill number is HR 4563. So if you want to track it, that's the bill. You can, obviously go online and read the entire bill, though I do warn you that it's quite long, and it's not a fun read for anybody. So
Well, I agree, Caleb, completely. I'll just say, because we don't have that much time, I'll just say, I'll leave it with, I think there's a 3L strategy. I think the first strategy is around litigation. And I'm saying that because I think that even those of us who are lay people have to recognize that we need a strong legal front. And so organizations like Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, you all have been a godsend for us in many ways, and being partners and being able to fight that. And so I just want to encourage people to actually support organizations, whether that's $25, $100, $1,000. We have got to make sure that we've got those who are on the front lines and those are fighting in the courtrooms and those civil rights organizations like the Lawyers Committee, that we need to make sure that that you all are very well funded and have the support you need. So that's one. I think that's part of the legal strategy. The second strategy I really think is around leadership, that we really have to have a strategy around how do we build a pipeline of leaders that really understand civil rights, that how are we literally training people on being able to recognize it. It's interesting because what we've been seeing bills that the language is so confusing that when people are actually looking at the language, they're not really clear about, well, am I voting for this or against that? That has been a trick that we've seen in the last few years. And I think it's going to take people be a little bit more sophisticated and understanding really around kind of civil rights and what is at stake. And so there's a major piece around leadership and learning that we actually put on the space that we're a big part of the work that we're doing is actually training and education of people in our communities, and the pipeline and those that are policymakers really need to be embedded, much greater equipped on how to really be able to deal with these civil rights attacks that are going on. And then the third thing I think is really around legislation. We're going to have to push for legislation, and we're going to have to be unyielding with it. We're entering a presidential election. Every single presidential candidate, I don't care what party, we should be just unyielding around what are your plans around restoring the Voting Rights Act. We're going to have to push and demand legislation. If we don't make it a priority, it will not be a priority. And so I think that that's the strategy that we have to think about around really supporting organizations that are on the front line doing this work, really building the leadership pipeline around information and education, and really making sure that we're pushing for legislation continuously, not just when it becomes an issue, but continuously so that we're ahead of it and not constantly operating in response and behind.
Fantastic. Thank you all. We have a lot of questions from the audience, and so I'm going to, and apologies to some of the other, I'm going to loop some of your questions that have commonalities together, but there is a lot of chatter about what the Lawyers Committee election protection is going to be doing. Some in response to elections that start as soon as this month in Virginia. Some general requests to how people can get plugged into election protection work and where they can find resources on some of the numbers that we've cited or some of the litigation that we filed. So I want to go to Julie for a little bit of that, but also make a plug that I will share my email at the end of this, as well as some of the different websites and resources that we encourage you all to visit too.
Thanks, Alex. So people can volunteer to work with election protection. There's grassroots or volunteers that help often in polling places in the states to observe what's going on inside, help voters who come out disappointed or voters going in who need some advice or assistance. So there's availability to volunteer for those grassroots positions that don't require a law background. And you receive training from groups on the ground with knowledge of the processes in the states. And that availability is on our electionprotection.org website. We also have opportunities for legal volunteers to help answer questions through the hotline. And again, you can volunteer through the hotline links for that opportunity as well. I'd also say that with respect to access to materials, the 866 Our Vote electionprotection.org website has state-specific information regarding all of the states in terms of when the elections are and how to cast a ballot, et cetera, and absentee voting rules, et cetera. So that information is available. Some of our litigation is on our Lawyers Committee website, lawyerscommittee.org, where some of our voting cases are posted as well. So that information is available to the public.
Beautiful. Well, we are about out of time here, but I want to thank all of our fantastic panelists for helping shed some light on this issue. I really appreciate the back and forth and the way that we are able to talk about what's happening federally, what's happening in the states, what's happening on the ground, and kind of hopefully give a complete picture. In the spirit of hopefully continuing that, I want to mention that my email will be at the end of this slide here. If you had a question that wasn't answered today, but you want to reach out, particularly to get plugged into election protection work or find out what your organization should be doing, I'd be happy to serve as a clearinghouse there. Thank you very much for all of the audience engagement that we got. I don't think that this is going to be the end of this issue, and I'd encourage everybody to stay in touch with us and to keep checking out these resources, particularly as we get further into election season. But with that, on behalf of the Lawyers Committee and our panelists, I want to wind this down and thank everybody for coming out today and caring so much about the health and the promise of our democracy.